Hello there. This is Kyou, the head of the Kyou system. I just got back from a fairly long road trip, and I drove through a truly magnificent thunderstorm. I think you might know the type, if you've ever done much driving yourself, or even if you've just ridden along in cars a good bit. It's the sort of storm where you often find the other drivers on the road along the interstate slowing down, oftentimes putting on their hazards in order to be seen through the torrential rains. Um, there's something about these storms. Driving through them, not just necessarily that, but the immense power of them, the immense strength of it all, the intensity of it. It has always inspired in me a certain sense of not fear, but more closer to reverence or awe. Now, this particular storm system that I drove through, it was very, very large. Was I could see it probably a good hour out, so in the area of 50, 60 miles, and it was this massive, massive, towering black cloud against the evening sky, and it was, even from the distance that I was at, it was lit up at least once a minute by cloud to cloud lightning or internal lightning, highlighting, throwing into stark contrast different parts of its structure. Sometimes bolts coming out and standing out in brilliant relief against the cloud itself, or just throwing a brief violet flash against the larger structure. And it had me mesmerized even just that far out. And as I got closer and closer to it, because of course the route I was taking had me driving directly toward it, figures, right? But I didn't mind it, not in this case. As I got closer to it, there was a certain point where there was no sound, no thunder, and there was no rain. But I reached a point where I was underneath at least the front lines of it, and every few seconds, it seemed like, at least 2 or 3 times a minute, there would be increasingly bright, increasingly closer flashes of lightning. And as I drew very, very near to what felt like the center of it, and what ultimately proved to be the center of it, I felt almost compelled as I was driving, and there was a rest area nearby, right? So I found myself feeling almost compelled to pull off under the rest stop. Now, I didn't especially need to eat anything or drink anything or go to the restroom or anything like that, but I just felt very strongly that I wanted to step out of the vehicle and just be under this atmosphere. So I did. And I made a point of parking pretty far away from the facility, so it would be at least like a minute or two of walking there and back. And there was just something so striking about it, so powerful beyond words, this feeling of, because it was pitch black, and this feeling of having this immense, unimaginably powerful system all around me. The scent of the oncoming storm, just heavy in the air, the wind gusting, the sky being lit every few seconds by lightning. It was, and yet so quiet, so very quiet. Very, very powerful moment. And eventually I got back into my car after I got back from the facilities, and I kept on driving, and sure enough, a few minutes later, it started to rain, lightly at first, but then as I went further, heavier and heavier, to the point where even having the windshield wipers going as fast as they could, it was, well, I'm sure you can imagine, visibility was very low, and there were a number of other drivers who were perhaps, I mean, I had to reduce my speed a good bit, but there were a number of other drivers who were had considerably slowed down, and of course trying to change lanes and navigate around them in that sort of storm can be a little dicey, but I didn't have any issues with that, fortunately. And then, and as I was going through that, lightning constantly all around me, to the point where I recall thinking at a few points where it almost felt like even if I had turned off my headlights, I would have been able to see perfectly fine with how close by and how frequent the lightning had become. There were a few points where it was as bright as daylight, if not brighter. And eventually I started to be able to hear thunder after that long, long stretch of silence. And it was something. I can say that much for sure. An experience I will not soon forget, and one that I wanted to share with you. It seemed like something that you might appreciate. I hope you do. I get the feeling that storms like these, normally in the past, when I was younger, they were very rare. Most of the storms that I can remember, at least. My memory is not exactly the best when it comes to my youth, but nevertheless, most of the storms that I could remember were always fleeting, much less intense, not nearly so much rain, certainly not nearly so much lightning. But in more recent times, especially in the past few years, it's become so much more intense, it seems like. Or the severe thunderstorms are so much more frequent. And I'm not going to wade into the questions as to what might be causing that or not. But in a way, I almost don't mind it that much. I feel like it's all too easy when we get caught up in the day-to-day affairs of things to, I guess, perhaps overinflate our own sense of importance, or overinflate the significance of the things going on around us, the things going on in our lives, the things going on in the lives of others. But to give an example, so I guess a very pertinent one. This road trip I was on, I was driving back from visiting some relatives of mine, my immediate family, for the 4th of July. And usually whenever I have a longer trip home like that, because I live by myself, so always the first day or so, especially the first evening returning from one of these trips, can be kind of melancholy. So, starting off on this trip, driving back to being by myself, was naturally a bit somber. Not that that's unusual for me, I suppose, but nevertheless. But when I came upon the storm system, especially as I grew closer and closer to it, and it became much harder to ignore, I was so just completely enthralled by it that so much so that not only did I completely clear my mind of any feelings of loneliness or isolation that I was brooding on. But I was so captivated that I silenced the audiobook that I was listening to, and I just drove almost in silence for a while. I say almost in silence because the storm was making itself quite known. It was rather loud at several points. Certainly, I was silent at least, and so was the sound system of my car. But the point I was going to make is that having these storms being so more frequent, right? Having them be more of something that isn't just going to be a rare occurrence, like a freak storm or something to that effect. It might not necessarily be altogether a bad thing. Now, obviously, there are attendant dangers involved. I know that there have been any number of tragedies and disasters involving flash flooding from storms like these, and certainly the idea that those are going to become more frequent as the storms become more frequent is sobering, to say the least. But I do think that, or I hope I should say, that having these storms and having them perhaps put things in perspective a little bit, help us to have more of a sense of scale in terms of, or a sense of perspective in terms of where we fall, where our issues fall in the grand scheme of things, as opposed to the larger might of nature, the larger picture of it all, and helping us to realize that we are not nearly so significant as we often like to think. We are not nearly so powerful as we like to think. And even these common storms, these precipitation, just simple water falling from the sky and static electricity, these simple things are not nearly so weak, and we are not nearly so much more powerful than them than we might like to think. Or something to that effect. But if nothing else, the drive I took this evening, will certainly be one that a memory that I may very well treasure in a way. And I hope you enjoyed hearing about it, and that you have a wonderful evening.